Eleanor Vance had come to believe that hope was a finite resource, like a lump of coal that once burned to ash could never be lit again. Her own supply had run out on her 24th birthday, leaving behind nothing but a fine grey dust that settled over her thoughts and dulled the very air she breathed. Her world was the colour of this ash, the slate sky over London, the grim wool of her uncle's coat, the cold gravy on her evening plate. She existed in a state of quiet, managed suffocation. Her uncle, Thomas Vance, was a man whose presence consumed all the oxygen in a room. He was not cruel in the manner of a storybook villain. He did not raise his voice or his hand. His tyranny was one of oppressive silence, of expectations that settled on Eleanor's shoulders like a leaden cloak. Since her parents' death, she had been his ward, and now he had informed her she was to be his asset. Lord Ashworth was the buyer, a man twice her age with damp hands and a smile that never quite reached his eyes, which were small and perpetually assessing, like a pawnbroker's. He spoke of profit margins and shipping interests, and when he looked at Eleanor, she felt inventoried. Her uncle saw a mutually beneficial alliance. Eleanor saw a different sort of cage, one with gilded bars but no more air than the one she already inhabited. The decision had been made without her consultation. It was presented to her as a fact. Solid and unchangeable as the stone fireplace in the drawing room. Her protest had been a whisper, swallowed by the thick carpets. "I do not wish it, uncle." He had simply looked up from his ledger, his gaze flat. "Your wishes are a luxury neither of us can afford." And that was the end of it. The wedding was to be in a month. The ash in her soul felt thicker than ever, so when the letter arrived, bearing the severe black wax seal of the Duke of Alnwick, it was merely a curiosity, a stone dropped into the stagnant pond of her life. It caused a ripple, but she expected it would soon be still again. Her uncle, however, saw the ducal crest and became animated, a flicker of avarice lighting his dull eyes. He assumed it was about some investment, some opportunity. He ordered Eleanor to attend the meeting with him, a silent, well-behaved ornament to prove his domestic stability. The Duke's London residence was a fortress of granite and silence. It did not welcome, it intimidated. They were shown into a study that seemed carved from shadow and old wood. Books stood in stoic ranks from floor to ceiling, their spines like silent soldiers. The air smelled of leather, beeswax, and something else, something lonely and cold, like winter earth. And then the Duke of Alnwick entered. He was taller than she had imagined, a man built of sharp angles and unyielding discipline. His dark hair was cut severely, and a faint, silver scar traced a line along his jaw, a flaw in an otherwise perfect, formidable mask. He moved with a quiet economy, no wasted gestures, his presence filling the vast room more completely than her uncle's ever could. He was, Eleanor thought with a strange detachment, the human embodiment of the house that contained him. He acknowledged her uncle with a curt nod, but his eyes, a startling, deep brown, the colour of wet soil at midnight, settled on her. They were not unkind, but they were unnervingly perceptive, as if they could see the fine grey dust coating her spirit. "Mr. Vance," the Duke began, his voice a low baritone that seemed to vibrate in the floorboards. "I will not waste your time with pleasantries. I have a proposition." He did not look at her uncle as he spoke. His gaze remained fixed on Eleanor. "I require a wife, a duchess, a woman of good breeding and quiet disposition to manage my household, and, in time, provide an heir." Eleanor's heart, a sluggish and forgotten thing, gave a painful lurch. Her uncle sputtered, his face a mottled canvas of confusion and dawning greed. The Duke ignored him. "I am offering your niece a contract, not a courtship. She will have the protection of my name, the security of my fortune, and complete autonomy within my homes. In return, I will require her loyalty, her discretion, and her presence at my side when society demands it. Her duties will be administrative. Her life, otherwise, will be her own. He paused, the silence stretching taut. I am offering her an escape. The last words were directed at her, and her alone. He saw her cage. He did not offer love or passion or any of the things the novels she hid in her room spoke of. He offered something far more tangible, more necessary. He offered air. Her uncle found his voice, a sycophantic, grasping sound. Your Grace, this is most unexpected. The matter of a dowry, of settlements, the settlement, the Duke cut in, his voice dropping a degree colder, is that I will take her from your house, and you will have no further claim on her. That is my only offer. Eleanor looked from her uncle's greedy, desperate face to the Duke's impassive one. Lord Ashworth's damp hands and transactional smile flashed in her mind. Then she thought of this cold, silent man and his offer of a life lived in quiet parallel. It was not a choice between happiness and misery. It was a choice between two different prisons. But one, at least, had a library and a key. She stood, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles were white. The Duke's gaze held hers. Waiting, he was not persuading her. He was allowing her to decide. It was the first real choice she had been given in years. I accept, Eleanor said, her voice small but clear in the cavernous room. The word felt strange and powerful on her tongue. It was a beginning, or perhaps just a different kind of ending. Blackwood Manor rose from the mist-shrouded hills like a slumbering giant. It was a place of grey stone and stark beauty, a castle that did not seem to welcome the sun. Eleanor's arrival was as quiet and formal as the marriage contract itself. The Duke had been there to greet her, a brief, correct nod her only welcome. He had then excused himself, vanishing back into the shadows of his domain, leaving her in the care of his housekeeper. Mrs. Gable was a woman who seemed to have been hewn from the same granite as the manor. Her posture was ramrod straight, her grey hair pulled into a knot so tight it looked painful. Her tour of the house was efficient, her explanations curt. The east wing was Eleanor's, the west wing was his Grace's. The library, the dining rooms, the drawing rooms, these were neutral territory. The geography of their marriage was laid out in corridors and closed doors. Her rooms were opulent, furnished with heavy dark wood and rich velvets in shades of sapphire and forest green. A fire had been laid in the hearth, but its warmth did not seem to penetrate the profound chill of the place. Eleanor walked to the tall window and looked out at the wild, untamed gardens. She felt like a ghost, a silent observer in a life that was supposed to be her own. The freedom the Duke had promised felt, for now, like a more elegant form of isolation. Their first dinner together was an exercise in strained civility. The dining hall was immense, the ceiling lost in darkness above them. They sat at opposite ends of a table long enough to host a royal banquet. The distance between them a vast, polished chasm. Footmen moved like spectres in the candlelight, their footsteps silenced by the thick Persian rug. The Duke spoke little, asking polite impersonal questions about her journey. He ate with the same focused discipline he applied to everything, his hands perfectly steady. Eleanor found herself watching the faint scar on his jaw, wondering how he had gotten it. It was the only part of him that suggested a history beyond this rigid control, a moment when his life had been touched by chaos. She answered his questions in quiet monosyllables, her own voice sounding thin and lost in the echoing space. The silence between them was not comfortable, it was heavy, laden with the unspoken terms of their arrangement. They were partners in a business, and this was their first formal meeting. After the meal, he led her to the main drawing room for coffee. It was another vast, intimidating space, dominated by a fireplace large enough to stand in. And there, lying on a worn rug before the crackling flames, was a creature that looked as ancient and formidable as the manor itself. It was a dog, a massive hound of indeterminate breed, with a grizzled grey muzzle and fur the colour of iron. Its head was broad, its shoulders powerful even in repose. As they entered, one of its eyes, a pale cloudy gold, cracked open and fixed on them. A low rumble, like distant thunder, vibrated from its chest. "Do not approach him," the Duke said, his voice flat. "That is Cerberus. He tolerates my presence. He does not extend the courtesy to others." Eleanor froze. She had heard whispers from the staff about the Duke's dog, a fearsome, half-wild beast that had been known to terrify visitors and tradesmen alike. It was considered the true master of Blackwood Manor, an extension of the Duke's own unapproachable nature. She took a seat in a wingback chair a safe distance from the fire, her hands folded primly in her lap. She felt a strange kinship with the animal. It, too, seemed a lonely, isolated creature, guarding a cold hearth. She did not try to speak to it, to coax it with soft words or a beckoning hand. She understood the desire to be left alone. She simply sat, the silence of the room broken only by the crackle of the fire and the ticking of a grandfather clock in the hall. She was lost in her own thoughts, tracing the patterns on the damask of her chair, when a movement caught her eye. The great dog, Cerberus, had lifted his heavy head. He watched her for a long, unblinking moment, his ancient gaze seeming to penetrate right through her carefully constructed composure. Then, with a groan of old bones, he pushed himself to his feet. The Duke, who had been pouring coffee at a sideboard, went still. Eleanor held her breath, her heart beginning a slow, heavy drum against her ribs. The dog was a study in deliberate motion. He did not hurry. He padded across the Aubusson carpet, his claws making no sound, his focus entirely on her. Eleanor remained perfectly motionless, not out of fear, but out of a sudden, profound understanding. This was a test, but not of courage. It was a test of stillness. He stopped before her chair. He was even larger up close, his head level with her lap. He smelled of wood smoke and damp earth. He looked at her one last time, a long, searching look, and then he blinked slowly. With a soft sigh that seemed to carry the weight of a decade of winters, he lowered his head and rested it, heavy and warm, upon her knee. The entire room seemed to fall into a vacuum of silence. The ticking of the clock, the hiss of the fire, everything vanished. Eleanor could feel the solid weight of him, the gentle rhythm of his breathing. Tentatively, her hand moved, her fingers sinking into the thick, coarse fur of his neck. He did not flinch. Instead, he leaned into her touch, a faint, rumbling purr of contentment rising from his chest. She looked up and met the Duke's eyes across the room. The mask was gone. His face was a landscape of pure, unadulterated shock. The coffee cup in his hand trembled slightly, a tiny, almost imperceptible tremor. He stared at the dog, then at her, and back again. In his eyes she saw not just surprise, but something deeper, something that looked almost like pain, or a memory suddenly unearthed. In 10 years, the staff had whispered, that dog had never chosen anyone. Everyone in the room went very still. It felt as if the very stones of Blackwood Manor were holding their breath. The moment with Cerberus had changed something between them, though Eleanor could not have said precisely what. It was as if a key had turned in a lock she hadn't known existed. The Duke's formality remained, a shield he held firmly in place, but now there were cracks in it. Tiny fissures through which something else occasionally peeked. He watched her now. When he thought she wasn't looking, she would catch his gaze on her from across the dinner table, or as they passed in a hallway, his expression a mixture of bewilderment and a reluctant, dawning curiosity. Their lives continued in their parallel tracks. She took over the household ledgers, finding a quiet satisfaction in bringing order to the sprawling estate. She spent her afternoons in the vast, silent library, a sanctuary she had only dreamed of. She would sit by the window, her worn book of poetry in her lap, and watch the wind stir the wild heather on the moors. She was still lonely, but it was a different kind of loneliness now. It was a loneliness with space to breathe, a quiet solitude rather than an oppressive confinement. Cerberus became her constant shadow. The old hound followed her from room to room, his heavy presence a silent, comforting weight. He would lie at her feet in the library, his snores a soft counterpoint to the rustle of turning pages. The staff watched this new allegiance with a kind of hushed awe. They began to look at her differently, too. She was not just the new duchess, a stranger in their midst. She was the woman the dog had chosen. One afternoon, the Duke found her in the library. She had not heard him enter, and his presence startled her. He stood in the doorway, simply watching her as she read, Cerberus asleep at her feet. "I see you have found your favorite corner," he said, his voice softer than usual. Eleanor's hand instinctively tightened on her small book. "The light is good here, Your Grace." He walked further into the room, his gaze falling to the book in her hands. It was a slender volume, its leather cover worn smooth with time and touch. "May I?" he asked, gesturing toward it. Hesitantly, she passed it to him. It was her only real possession, a gift from her mother, filled with poems of nature and quiet contemplation. It was the only piece of her old life she had brought with her that was not tainted with ash. He handled it with a surprising gentleness, his long fingers tracing the faded gold lettering on the spine. He opened it to a page marked with a dried wildflower. "Sonnets of the Seasons," he read aloud, then looked at her. "It seems well loved." "It was my mother's," she said quietly. "It helps me organize my thoughts." A flicker of something, understanding perhaps, passed through his eyes. He handed the book back to her, their fingers brushing for a fleeting instant. The contact sent a strange, unexpected warmth through her. It felt like the first drop of rain after a long drought. "My mother also found solace in these shelves," he said, his gaze sweeping the room. She said each book was a different kind of silence. He turned to leave, then paused in the doorway. "Eleanor," he said, using her given name for the first time. The sound of it in his deep voice was both jarring and strangely intimate. "The dog, he has not been this peaceful since." He trailed off, the sentence left unfinished. He seemed to wrestle with himself for a moment, then simply gave a curt nod and was gone, leaving a profound and echoing silence in his wake. The fragile piece of her new life was shattered by the arrival of a letter. The familiar, spidery script of her uncle's hand on the envelope made her stomach clench with a cold, familiar dread. She took it to her room and opened it with trembling fingers. It was exactly as she had feared. Thomas Vance was not a man to accept defeat. The letter was a tirade of accusations and threats. He claimed the marriage was invalid, that she had been coerced. He wrote of her duty, of the arrangements he had made with Lord Ashworth. He demanded her immediate return to London, ending with a chillingly paternal line, "I will come for you if I must. You are my responsibility." The old suffocation returned, pressing in on her. The walls of her beautiful room suddenly felt like the bars of her cage again. He would not let her go. He still saw her as his property, a thing to be controlled and sold. She hid the letter in a locked drawer, but she could not hide the fear that coiled in her gut. That evening at dinner, she could barely eat. She felt the Duke's eyes on her, his gaze more probing than usual. She kept her own eyes fixed on her plate, hoping he would not see the tremor in her hands. Later, as she walked through the dimly lit gallery, intending to retreat to her wing, his voice stopped her. "Is something amiss, Your Grace?" She turned. He stood near a tall window, the moonlight casting his face in silver and shadow. Making the scar on his jaw stand out in sharp relief, he looked like a figure from a Gothic tale, stern and unreadable. "I am merely tired," she lied, her voice thin. He did not move closer, yet his presence seemed to fill the space between them. "You received a letter from London today. It was not a question. The man missed nothing. It appears to have distressed you." The old instinct to hide, to make herself small and invisible, rose up in her. But then she looked at him, at this cold, disciplined man who had offered her a key, and she felt a flicker of something else. Defiance. She had accepted his contract. She was the Duchess of Alnwick. "My uncle is not pleased with my decision," she said, her voice gaining a fraction of its strength. "He believes he can undo it." The Duke was silent for a long moment, his expression unreadable in the gloom. Then he took a step toward her. "Let me be clear," he said, his voice low and intense, each word a stone dropped into a deep well. "Thomas Vance has no authority here. You are the Duchess of Alnwick. You are the mistress of this house. No one can command you here. No one can remove you from it, unless you yourself wish to leave." His words were a shield, offered without warmth but with an undeniable absolute strength. He was protecting his investment, she told herself. He was defending his name, his Duchess. But as he stood there, a formidable guardian in the moonlight, she felt something more. It was not kindness, not yet. It was a promise. A wall of granite between her and the past, and it was up to her to stand behind it. The Duke's unfinished sentence in the library echoed in Eleanor's mind. "He has not been this peaceful since," the words hinted at a history. A grief that she sensed was the very bedrock of Blackwood Manor and its master. She began to watch, to listen. She was an observer by nature, and in the quiet halls of her new home, details began to emerge like objects in a developing photograph. She started with Mrs. Gable one morning as they reviewed the week's menus in the housekeeper's office. Eleanor steered the conversation with careful subtlety. Cerberus lay at her feet, his tail giving a lazy thump against the floorboards. "Cerberus seems to have accepted me," Eleanor began, stroking the dog's broad head. "His Grace mentioned he has been with him a long time." Mrs. Gable's stern features softened for a fraction of a second as she looked at the dog. "He has, Your Grace. He was not always the Duke's, you see." The housekeeper paused, her pen hovering over the ledger. "He belonged to Master Julian." "Master Julian?" Eleanor asked gently. "His Grace's younger brother, Mrs. Gable supplied, her voice lowering. A different soul entirely he was, full of light and laughter. The very opposite of the Duke, if you'll forgive my saying so. This house used to be a brighter place when he was in it." She sighed, a small, sad sound. Cerberus was his, a gangly pup that followed him everywhere. They were inseparable. A cold dread crept into Eleanor's chest. "What happened to him?" "A riding accident, Your Grace. 10 years ago this autumn, thrown from his horse during a storm. His Grace was with him." The housekeeper's voice was barely a whisper now. "He carried him back himself. But it was too late. The Duke, he was never the same after that day. He closed himself off. And the dog, well, the dog has been grieving ever since. Until you came." The pieces clicked into place with devastating clarity. The Duke's impenetrable sorrow, his rigid control, the scar on his jaw. And Cerberus, the living, breathing embodiment of a decade-old grief. The dog had not chosen her because she was special. He had chosen her because he sensed in her a spirit as quiet and wounded as his own. She was a stillness he recognized. And in accepting her, he had unwittingly shown her the key to his master's locked heart. She saw him now not as a cold, formidable stranger, but as a man encased in ice, frozen at the moment of a great and terrible loss. His silence was not emptiness. It was a vigil. That evening, drawn by an instinct she did not understand, she found herself walking toward the west wing. It was forbidden territory, but she felt a pull she could not resist. A single line of light shone from beneath the door of his study. Taking a breath, she knocked softly. "Enter," his voice commanded, sharp and surprised. She pushed the door open. He was not at his desk. He stood by the mantelpiece, his back to her, staring into the fire. In his hand he held a small oval object that glinted in the firelight. As she stepped into the room, he turned, and for a moment he did not have time to erect his mask. His expression was unguarded, raw with a pain so profound it stole her breath. He did not try to hide what he was holding. It was a miniature portrait, painted on ivory and set in a gold frame. He held it out for her to see. The young man in the portrait was beautiful. He had the Duke's dark hair, but his eyes were full of mischief and light, his lips curved in a perpetual, easy smile. He looked like a man who had never known a day of sorrow. "My brother Julian," the Duke said, his voice rough. It was not an explanation, but a confession. Eleanor moved to stand beside him, her shoulder almost brushing his. They stood in silence for a long time, looking at the laughing face in the portrait. "He was the light of this house," the Duke said, his voice so low she could barely hear it. Cerberus was his. He finally looked at her, and his eyes were dark with unshed tears. "The scar," he said, his fingers unconsciously tracing the faint line on his jaw. "The branch that struck me, it's what startled his horse." The admission hung in the air between them, heavy and terrible. It was a burden he had carried alone for 10 years. The guilt, the belief that he was responsible. He had not just lost his brother, he had lived every day since believing he had caused it. Eleanor's heart ached for him. She did not offer empty words of comfort. There were none that could touch a wound so deep. Instead, she reached out and, with a courage she did not know she possessed, gently placed her hand on his arm. His muscles were rigid beneath the fine wool of his coat, a body braced for a blow that had landed a decade ago and had never stopped landing. He did not pull away. He simply stood there, a statue of grief, allowing her touch. In that shared silent moment, the contract between them dissolved, replaced by something fragile and human and real. He was no longer just the Duke of Alnwick. He was Arthur, and he was utterly, devastatingly broken. He had shown her his deepest wound, entrusting her with the truth of his pain. He had made himself vulnerable, and in doing so, had handed her the power to either shatter him completely or to help him begin to heal. The storm broke 2 days later. Eleanor was arranging flowers in the morning room when she saw the carriage, a hired hack from the village, rumbling up the long gravel drive. A cold knot of certainty formed in her stomach even before the footman announced the visitors. Her uncle had come for her. She met them in the great hall. Her uncle stood there, his face pinched with righteous fury, and beside him, looking deeply uncomfortable, was Lord Ashworth. Cerberus, who had been dozing by the main staircase, rose to his feet, a low, menacing growl starting deep in his chest. "Eleanor," her uncle began, his voice booming with false authority. "This foolishness ends now. You will pack your things. Lord Ashworth has been good enough to accompany me to escort you home." She felt a tremor of her old fear, the instinct to bow her head and acquiesce. But then she felt the solid presence of Cerberus at her side, and she thought of Arthur, alone in his study with his brother's portrait. She was not just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for this house, for the fragile peace she had found within its grey walls, and for the man who was its heart. "I am home, Uncle," she said, her voice quiet but carrying the force of conviction. From the top of the grand staircase, a voice cut through the tension. "She is, indeed." The Duke descended the stairs, not with haste, but with a deliberate, intimidating calm. He came to stand beside Eleanor, a silent, unmovable wall of support. He did not, however, speak for her. His eyes, hard as chips of flint, met hers, and in them she saw a question. This was her battle to fight. Her uncle sputtered, gesturing wildly between them. "Your Grace, this is a family matter. This girl is my ward. She has been deluded, coerced into this sham of a marriage. I am here to see it annulled. This was the moment, the precipice. Her entire future rested on the words she chose next. She held the leverage of her new title, but more than that, she held the knowledge of the man beside her, of the grief he carried. She was not just a duchess, she was the keeper of his trust. She took a step forward, placing herself slightly in front of the Duke. She addressed her uncle, her voice ringing with a clarity and strength she had never known she possessed. There was no coercion. I made a choice. I chose to leave your house, and I chose to marry this man. I am the Duchess of Alnwick, and you have no more power over me. Insolence. Her uncle roared, his face turning a blotchy red. You will do as you are told. No, she said, the words simple and absolute. I will not. This is my home now. This is my life. A life I chose freely. She turned her head slightly to look at Lord Ashworth, who was visibly wilting under the Duke's glacial stare. And I would rather spend an eternity in a crypt than 1 hour as your wife. My lord. A shocked silence fell over the hall. Her uncle looked as if she had struck him. He had come expecting the timid, compliant niece he had always known. He was not prepared for the woman standing before him. Eleanor's gaze returned to her uncle, her eyes clear and unwavering. You will leave this house. You will not write to me. You will not attempt to contact me again. We are finished. As if on cue, Cerberus took a step forward, the growl in his chest intensifying into a sound of pure threat. The dog stood squarely between Eleanor and her former guardian, a clear and final declaration of allegiance. Thomas Vance stared at her, at the formidable Duke, at the terrifying dog. He saw the truth in her eyes. His authority was broken, his asset lost. With a strangled cry of rage, he turned on his heel and stormed out of the hall, dragging a pale and sweating Lord Ashworth with him. The great oak doors boomed shut behind them, the sound echoing in the sudden, profound silence. It was over. She had done it. She had stood on her own feet and spoken her own truth. She had defended her new life, not by hiding behind the Duke, but by standing in front of him. Her heart hammered against her ribs, not with fear, but with the wild, exhilarating pulse of freedom. She had not waited for a rescue. She had rescued herself. In the echoing silence of the great hall, Eleanor could hear nothing but the frantic beating of her own heart. She did not dare to look at the man beside her. She had acted with a boldness that felt alien, a strength borrowed from the very stones of the manor. Now, in the aftermath, a wave of uncertainty washed over her. Had she overstepped? Had she presumed too much? Then he spoke her name, and the sound of it broke the spell. Eleanor. It was not the formal title, nor the hesitant use of her Christian name in the library. This was different. It was soft, filled with a wonder that made her finally turn to face him. The Duke Arthur was looking at her not with the shock he'd shown when Cerberus chose her, but with an expression of deep, unguarded reverence. The ice in his eyes had melted, and in their dark depths she saw a warmth she had never imagined possible. My proposal, he began, his voice low and earnest, was not entirely a matter of convenience. That was a lie, or at least a half-truth. He took a step closer, closing the small distance between them. I saw you once, a year ago, at a dreadful soiree in London. You were standing by a window, half hidden by a curtain, watching the crowd. You looked serene, as if you carried your own quiet world inside you. I asked who you were. Eleanor stared at him, speechless. I made inquiries, he continued, a faint flush rising on his neck. I learned of your circumstances, of your uncle, of the arrangement he was planning. My offer was not a contract, it was a rescue. But I was a coward. I hid it behind the cold walls of a business transaction because I did not believe a man like me, a man made of silence and shadow, had anything more to offer a woman like you." He reached out, his hand hovering for a moment before his fingers gently cupped her cheek. His touch was warm, hesitant, as if he were touching something priceless and fragile. "And then you came here, and you brought a quiet grace this house has not known in a decade. You soothed the ghost that haunts these halls without even trying." His gaze flickered down to Cerberus, who now sat peacefully at her feet. "He knew before I did. He recognized your heart." Tears welled in Eleanor's eyes, blurring his face. All her life she had felt invisible, a grey ash of a person. But this man, this formidable broken man, had seen her. "I did not know if you could ever see this place as a home," he whispered, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw, "or see me as anything more than a jailer with better manners than your last. But what you just did, you defended us. You claimed us. Could you, Eleanor? Could you truly choose this life? Could you choose me?" She did not need words. She leaned into his touch, her answer in the simple, trusting gesture. It was all the encouragement he needed. He lowered his head, and his lips met hers. The kiss was not one of passion, but of profound, cathartic release. It was the taste of rain after a drought, the feeling of a long-held breath finally let go. It was a promise of healing, a quiet affirmation that even the deepest winter could give way to spring. 1 year later, the grey stones of Blackwood Manor seemed to have absorbed the sunlight. The oppressive silence that had once filled its halls had been replaced by a quiet hum of life. Laughter could, on occasion, be heard from the gardens. Eleanor stood on the south terrace, a soft shawl around her shoulders. The untamed gardens she had first seen from her window were now interspersed with carefully tended beds of lavender and roses, their scent rising on the warm afternoon air. She was no longer a ghost in this house, she was its heart, and she had taught it how to beat again. A pair of strong arms wrapped around her from behind, and she leaned back into her husband's solid warmth. Arthur rested his chin on her shoulder, his hand coming to rest protectively over her gently swelling abdomen. "Mrs. Gable is in a state of panic," he murmured into her hair. "She is convinced the nursery curtains are not the correct shade of yellow. She called it insipid." Eleanor smiled. "She will find the perfect shade. She always does." They stood in comfortable silence, watching the sun begin its slow descent toward the rolling hills. At their feet, Cerberus lay sleeping in a patch of sunlight, his old bones enjoying the warmth. He was slower now, his muzzle almost entirely white, but his dreams seemed peaceful, his watch finally over. The grey ash that had once coated Eleanor's world was gone, replaced by the vibrant colours of the garden, the deep, warm brown of her husband's eyes, the hopeful yellow of a nursery. She had come to Blackwood Manor seeking refuge and had found a home. She had been offered a contract and had found a love as quiet, patient, and resilient as the stones around them. True strength, she had learned, was not the absence of wounds, but the courage to let another soul tend to them. And true freedom was not an escape from a cage, but the choice to build a sanctuary, together.